Hi friends, this video is part 2 of lecture 4. It will conclude our study of Plato's Republic and also mark the end of Unit 1. In the last part of lecture 4, we explored the difference between knowledge and belief for Plato, and we're continuing with that topic in this video. We're going to focus here on one of Plato's most famous doctrines, his theory of forms, which will get us into one of the most memorable passages in the history of philosophy, Plato's cave allegory. That will then lead to a discussion of what Plato calls the form of the good, and why he believes this form has a special role to play in living a good life. So far, we've seen how Plato thinks that knowledge is possible for us. But what exactly do we have knowledge of? This is a pivotal question because Plato has a unique perspective on it, and it takes us into the realm of metaphysics, the branch of philosophy concerned with the fundamental nature of reality beyond the world of sense perception. For Plato, how things really are cannot be easily gleaned from the world we can touch, see, hear, taste, and smell. In other words, he's skeptical that our senses can provide us with genuine knowledge. Why? Because according to him, the world of sense perception, the empirical world, is always changing, always in flux. Think of a river. It may look the same each time you see it, but it's never the same water flowing through. This constant change and alteration is a feature of everything in the empirical world, and it makes sensory objects unreliable as foundations for stable knowledge, according to Plato. So, if not from the empirical world, where does knowledge come from? Plato here introduces a groundbreaking idea, the theory of forms. In his view, true knowledge comes from understanding abstract, unchanging forms, or ideals, that exist beyond our sensory experience. And we access these forms not primarily through our senses, but through our reason. Let's unpack this a bit with some examples. Picture a triangle. Pause this video for a couple of seconds, close your eyes, and visualize a triangle in your mind's eye. Got the image? Good. Now, what you're likely picturing is a specific type of triangle. For some of you, it's an equilateral triangle. For some, an isosceles. For others, a scalene. But those are just imagistic representations that depict different versions of triangles. What makes all of them triangles? For Plato, it's the form of the triangle, a perfect, abstract representation defined as a closed, three-sided plane figure. When I put all of those words together in that form, all of you now have in mind the form of the triangle. For Plato, this formal representation of the triangle is what gives every individual sensory triangle its triangularity. But he doesn't stop here with abstract geometric shapes. Believe it or not, Plato would say there's also a form of a sandwich. Every sandwich you've ever had, whether it's a PB&J, a turkey club, or a veggie wrap, participates in the ideal abstract form of a sandwich, which captures the essence of sandwichness, and which we come to understand primarily through reasoning about the nature of a sandwich. This philosophical position makes Plato what we today call a rationalist about knowledge, as opposed to an empiricist. A rationalist believes that reason, rather than sense experience, is the primary way in which we access knowledge of the world. These considerations also lead Plato to conclude that the forms are more real than the world of sense perception. Why? Because material things, things found in the world of sense perception, are always in flux, always changing and in a state of becoming, always rolling around as intermediaries between what is not and what purely is, as Plato says in Book 5 of the Republic. A material drawing of a triangle will eventually fade away. Sandwiches decompose. What appears beautiful from one angle may not look beautiful from another. In contrast, the forms are stable. The form of a triangle, the form of a sandwich, and the form of beauty itself are all abstract ideals that have an enduring permanence. This permanence is what, for Plato, makes them more real than their sensory counterparts. Now, you might ask, if we can't see, smell, taste, or touch these forms, how can they be real? This is where Plato challenges our sensory biases. We're accustomed to thinking that only what we can access through sense perception is real. But for Plato, this is a limited viewpoint. It's a bias that keeps us from recognizing a deeper, more stable reality. In fact, Plato argues it's due to the forms that things in the world of sense perception exist at all. Triangles, sandwiches, trees, tables, beautiful works of art, just actions, courageous heroes. Each of these things that appear to us through the senses has a corresponding set of forms that makes them have the distinctive nature they have. So the takeaway here is that the real world isn't what it seems to be. What we usually perceive as reality is only a partial truth. The full scope of reality is quite different. And it's this fuller, truer reality that the rational part of the soul yearns for. Which brings us again to the philosopher's love of wisdom. It's a love not just for any knowledge, but for knowledge of the forms, the most real things, according to Plato. On this basis, he concludes that those who love wisdom, who are drawn to these forms, are best suited to figure out how to live a good life. Philosophers look to the forms in organizing their souls and ruling themselves, aiming for a life of internal balance, the life of justice, as Plato thinks of it. And it's the same orientation toward the forms, he believes, that qualifies philosophers to rule in the political sphere. This is because philosophers also look to the forms as guiding principles in organizing society, ensuring it aligns with what's real and just and good. But how do we get to know these forms? How does reason come to rule in a person? Plato's answer is straightforward yet profound. Education. His idea of education, however, is not a hodgepodge of random subjects. It's a carefully crafted curriculum designed to nurture and support the rational part of the soul. Early on in the Republic, Plato mentions the importance of poetry and music as foundational subjects in the education of reason. By Book 7, he expands this list dramatically, including arithmetic, geometry, stereometry or solid geometry, astronomy, and harmonics. Each of these subjects plays a crucial role in preparing the mind for the ultimate subject, dialectic, the practice of reasoned inquiry and argument with others. Now, why does Plato put such an emphasis on mathematics in the education of the philosopher? First, because math deals with abstract objects. When you study math, you're training your mind to go beyond the world of sense perception, to see more than just what meets the eye or ear. You're venturing into the realm of the forms. Second, studying mathematics involves a kind of internal mental activity that makes your education a personal achievement. Recall the example of the grid that demonstrated why 3 times 3 is 9 in the last part of this lecture. Understanding this mathematical fact wasn't just a memorization task. It required a level of personal intellectual engagement to grasp the why beyond the what. Finally, a note on dialectic, the pinnacle of Plato's educational pyramid. Dialectic isn't about winning debates. It's about the practice of good-natured and well-reasoned inquiry and argument with other people. It's the tool that allows philosophers to probe, question, and understand the forms, which solidifies the nature of the philosopher as a lover of wisdom. So this gives us a better idea of the importance of education for Plato in living a good life. The kind of education he's promoting isn't a matter of book learning or acquiring academic credentials. Instead, it's a transformative experience that involves coming to see things in a new way. Which leads us to one of the most unforgettable passages in the history of philosophy, Plato's allegory of the cave. Let's consider the opening of the passage together. Compare the effect of education and of the lack of it on our nature, Socrates says, to an experience like this. Imagine human beings living in an underground cave-like dwelling with an entrance a long way up, which is both open to the light and as wide as the cave itself. They've been there since childhood, fixed in the same place with their necks and legs fettered, able to see only in front of them because their bonds prevent them from turning their heads around. Light is provided by a fire burning far above and behind them. Also behind them, but on higher ground, there's a path stretching between them and the fire. Imagine that along this path, a low wall has been built, like the screen in front of puppeteers above which they show their puppets. Glaucon responds, "I'm imagining it." And Socrates then says, "Then also imagine that there are people along the wall carrying all kinds of artifacts that project above it, statues of people and other animals made out of stone, wood, and every material. And as you'd expect, some of the carriers are talking and some are silent." Glaucon says, "It's a strange image you're describing, and strange prisoners." And Socrates replies, "They're like us." As you listen to this, you might think it sounds more like the plot of a science fiction movie than a philosophical text. But Plato wants us to consider carefully what each of the elements in this image represents. Let's start with the prisoners chained in the cave. All they can see, Plato says, are the shadows cast on the wall in front of them from the puppets carried by the puppeteers behind them. For these prisoners, the shadows constitute the whole of their reality. They don't know of the existence of the puppeteers and don't know that the images are artificially produced. These prisoners signify people who have acquired their understanding of the world unreflectively from authority figures. In Plato's time, these authority figures would include sophists, politicians, and the like. Fast forward to our own time, and the prisoners could be us if we based our understanding of what to believe and what to desire entirely on external influences. These sources of influence would include not only all of the authority figures in our lives, but things like advertising, social media, and pop culture. What we see here, according to Plato, are not real things, but shadows of reality, images, interpretations, and appearances that others, the puppeteers behind the wall, have manufactured for us. Plato goes on to describe the ascent out of the cave, starting with those freed from their chains who turn away from the wall and recognize the puppeteers and the fire. These people, beginning their ascent, signify those who have a greater awareness of the sources of their information, who begin to question how they've been influenced to believe and desire certain things. But for Plato, this awareness isn't enough. It's not enough to just understand how one's beliefs and desires have been shaped. To truly grasp the nature of things, you must climb higher and exit the cave altogether. This represents the transition from merely accepting appearances to engaging in dialectic, the pinnacle of philosophical study, and examining the forms. So what Plato's offering here in the cave allegory is not just a metaphor for education, it's a call to action. It's a challenge for us to rise up above the limitations of our initial upbringings and perceptions, to seek something deeper and more real, and to engage in the kind of independent thinking that leads to wisdom. But what Plato also emphasizes in the cave allegory is the difficulty of this educational journey. There are two difficulties here. First, to love wisdom for Plato is to be motivated to leave the cave and to see things differently. But coming to see things differently by reevaluating our beliefs and desires is hard. In reading the allegory, you'll notice that each step toward the exit is a struggle and painful. This makes sense within the logic of the allegory. It's much more comfortable to remain a prisoner in relative darkness and indulge yourself with what are really only shadows. There's a certain pleasure we feel in the familiar, even if it's a distorted view of reality. It's cozy and warm at the bottom of the cave, passively accepting what authority figures and society tell you is just and brave and beautiful and true. Feeling complacent and confident about our beliefs feels good, while confronting the limits of our understanding can feel like a threat to our identity. The practice of dialectic on this view is not just an intellectual exercise, it's an emotional and psychological struggle. Nevertheless, it's the task of the philosopher, for anyone who aspires to wisdom, according to Plato, to walk the steep path out of the cave into the light. The second difficulty of this journey is that it's not just a personal quest for enlightenment. Plato adds another layer of complexity. The philosopher has a responsibility to return to the cave and help others in the same situation. And we shouldn't romanticize this return. It's a dangerous endeavor. The philosopher risks ridicule, misunderstanding, or even outright hostility from those who still find comfort in the cave. This danger is part of what makes the philosopher's task so politically significant. It's not just about knowing, it's about doing philosophy with others, and doing so in the face of personal risks. For Plato, it's exactly what Socrates tried to do in his life, a life devoted not just to wisdom, but to the betterment of his fellow citizens. So the message here is clear. The pursuit of knowledge in the Republic is both a personal struggle and a collective responsibility. It requires courage, resilience, and a sense of commitment, not just to oneself, but to one's broader community. The influence of Plato's cave allegory has stretched long and far over the centuries. It's turned up in a variety of forms and had a powerful impact, not just in the history of philosophy, but in literature, art, music, and movies. Plato's message in the allegory about the importance of questioning prejudices and conventional ways of thinking has also resonated for political activists, as can be seen in this quote from Huey Newton, co-founder of the Black Panther Party. In his autobiography, Revolutionary Suicide, Newton draws a direct parallel between Plato's prisoners and college students he encountered in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1960s. I reflected that many of the students who were supposedly learning how to analyze and understand phenomena were, in fact, caught up in the same predicament as the prisoners in Plato's cave allegory, Newton writes. Even though they were in college, they were still prisoners in the cave of exploitation and racism that black people have been subjected to for centuries. Far from preparing them to deal with reality, college kept their intellects in chains. Newton's critique here emphasizes the Platonic point that education should be liberating, not confining. Like Plato, he argues that a genuine education involves recognizing and breaking free from the chains that bind our understanding, whether those chains are ignorance, social conditioning, or systemic injustice. The irony, as Newton points out, is that even students in college, students who are supposed to be learning how to think critically and independently, even they can remain prisoners of social prejudices and systemic oppression. This highlights the profound challenge of education. To truly enlighten, it must go beyond surface learning and foster a mode of thinking for oneself that challenges and transforms entrenched beliefs and structures. So we've discussed now the difficult journey of leaving the cave, the painful process of questioning our most basic beliefs, and even the perilous task of returning to help others make the climb. But what makes this immense struggle worthwhile? Plato's answer is as cryptic as it is profound: the form of the good. As he has Socrates put it in Book 6 of the Republic, that which gives truth to the things known and the power to know to the knower is the form of the good. And though it is the cause of knowledge and truth, it's also an object of knowledge. Both knowledge and truth are beautiful things, but the good is other and more beautiful than they. In this impactful quote, Plato speaks of the form of the good as the ultimate goal of philosophical inquiry. It's not just another form among forms. It's the form that gives coherence, meaning, and most importantly, truth to all the other forms. According to Plato, it's this form of the good that makes the very possibility of knowledge and truth real for us. You can think of the form of the good in this sense as a beacon, illuminating the path out of the cave and into an understanding of what's truly valuable. It's what makes the painful struggle of education and the dangerous return to the cave not only necessary, but deeply fulfilling. It's a crucial point for Plato because living a good life on this view is not only about having a well-ordered soul internally, it's also about aligning your soul with this higher external principle of the good. So we're now reaching the conclusion of our study of Plato, from the ethics of living justly to the metaphysics of the forms. Whatever his views are on the form of the good, and his views are pretty opaque, they nevertheless offer a powerful insight. Plato's arguing that the quality of a human life is enriched by our connection to something worthwhile and valuable that lies outside of ourselves. The good life on this view is not a life of self-indulgence or a solo endeavor focused on one's personal gain. Instead, it requires a unique psychological condition, one of openness and receptivity to the goodness in the world and to objects of intrinsic worth, like the forms that exist independently of us. By turning our attention outward in this way, to the good that lies outside of us, we counteract the tendency towards self-centeredness that Glaucon in Book 2 believed is characteristic of human nature. The constitution of the just person's soul here stands in stark contrast to lives of injustice, lives dominated by the desire for status, power, wealth, or sensory pleasure. Such pursuits, Plato argues, not only endanger society, but also have a negative effect on our own potential for self-realization and genuine happiness, or eudaimonia. Again, the cave allegory is instructive on this point. The philosopher's journey out of the cave and subsequent return is driven by a commitment to something greater than themselves. Unlike the tyrant, obsessed with power and domination, the philosopher focuses on the rational, enduring order of the forms, striving to integrate this order both within themselves and in the social fabric. And if this is right, we can see how internal justice for Plato isn't only a personal good. The just soul naturally extends their care outward to create a harmonious and just society. So internal justice does result in external justice. In this sense, Plato's philosophy offers a compelling vision. The life most worth living is one that's attuned to a greater reality, whether it's the intellectual rigor of understanding the forms or genuine connectedness with others. A reality that goes beyond what's immediately before us and our self-centered desires. It's this that allows us to transcend our limitations for Plato, to live well in a manner that's aligned with our deepest values. This marks the end of Unit 1 and our study of Plato's approach to the good life. In this video, we've covered Plato's views on the role of reason in the good life in connection with his theory of forms. We've considered his allegory of the cave and touched on the difficulty and the transformative power of education as he understands it, symbolized by the journey out of the cave into the dazzling light of the forms. Finally, we concluded by examining Plato's belief that the goodness of the just life is deeply connected to something valuable outside of ourselves, be it the intellectual pursuit of understanding the world or establishing a genuine connection with others. Now it's your turn to engage with these ideas on a more practical level. This week, you're embarking on a series of philosophical exercises designed to deepen your understanding of Plato's approach to the good life. These exercises aim not only to reinforce what you've learned, but also to challenge you to apply Platonic principles to your own lives. I'm really looking forward to seeing how these exercises enrich your understanding of Plato's views, and hope you enjoy them.